The Egyptian gods in the anime dominated the field every time they were brought out. The gods were so powerful that their presence on the field would warp the duel around them, turning any duelist who wielded even one god card into an unstoppable behemoth. And in real life, these cards are complete duds. They've seen virtually no play, with even casual players struggling to find their value. But that raises an important question. Why don't they work? How did the Egyptian gods go from game-ending powerhouses to being completely worthless in the actual trading card game? But before we can accurately talk about how good the Egyptian gods are, we need to look at what they actually do. The god cards are all level 10 divine beast monsters with the same stipulations. This card requires 3 tributes to be normal summoned, and this summon cannot be negated. Additionally, cards and effects cannot be activated when this card is summoned, with the exception of Ra. Once per turn during the end phase, if this card is special summoned, send it to the graveyard. Other than that, they all have their own separate effects. Slifer the Sky Dragon has question mark attack and defense. Slifer also gains 1000 attack and defense for each card in your hand, and if a monster is normal or special summoned to your opponent's field in attack position, that monster loses 2000 attack, and if its attack is reduced to 0, then destroy it. Obelisk the Tormentor has 4000 attack and defense, and interestingly cannot be targeted by card effects. Obelisk can tribute 2 other monsters the player controls, and destroy all monsters your opponent controls. This card cannot declare an attack the turn this effect is activated. The Winged Dragon of Ra has question mark attack and defense, and when it is summoned, the player can pay as many of their life points until they have 100 left. This card gains attack and defense equal to the amount of life points paid. You can pay 1000 life points, then target one monster on the field and destroy it. Even within the context of the time period that these cards got released in, they are all borderline unusable, with Obelisk being released in 2010, Ra being released in 2011, and Slifer being released in 2012. Several other boss monsters already had existed that were easier to summon, more powerful, and had entire decks that actually synergized with them. For this section of the video, we will just be checking what the Egyptian gods do during the early 2010s. The Egyptian gods suffer from needing to all be normal summoned with 3 tributes, as in 2011, reliably swarming the field to produce 3 whole monsters for one monster was not exactly a consistent strategy. The need of 3 monsters also meant that the Egyptian gods were not splashable monsters that could easily be interspersed into every deck, especially ones where consistent special summoning was occurring. This essentially meant that you would either need to have a deck that naturally would spam the field with monsters to be tributed for a god card, or dedicate an entire deck to summoning them, which means that by the very nature of their design, god cards would drag down the entire deck that was built around them. You could also compare the ease of the summoning of the gods to either boss monsters of its time, such as Judgment Dragon or Trishula. Judgment Dragon can be special summoned by having 4 or more Lightsworn monsters in a grave, which was easily doable and wouldn't require your normal summon, or even Trishula, which does specifically require 3 monsters like the Egyptian gods, and needs 1 tuner and appropriate levels, is offset by Trishula being stored in the extra deck, meaning that you could access it at any time. Now it seems that there was an attempt to simulate the near invulnerable status of the gods in the anime by giving them protection on summon, which was definitely needed, but during the time the gods came out, common traps like Solemn Judgment, Torrential Tribute, and Bottomless Trap Hole were mainstays in meta decks, which would mean that you wouldn't go -3 after spending so much time and energy into summoning a Slifer. Unfortunately, this protection doesn't get extended to general protection, as once the god has been summoned, which heavily restricts the reliability of the gods. Having no protection against effect destruction or even targeting protection means that your gods are all vulnerable to cards like Dimension Prison, Mirror Force, or Compulsory, which pretty much every deck was running a number of these. Needing to invest 3 summons into a single monster that could go all to waste with a single Regeki break was why it was so hard to create a deck dedicated to summoning one of the gods. This obviously doesn't apply to obelisks, but we'll move on to that part later. Another reason for the lack of viability was special summoning restrictions. Sending the god to the grave after a special summon fairly balanced out the card in the anime, as they were all buffed up variants of their real life cards, so hand destruction into Monster Reborn wouldn't just give Yugi the easy win in every duel. Now in real life, Slifer and Obelisk being sent to the grave basically means that any utility would be wasted on them, as games were much slower, so more often than not you wouldn't be able to finish off a duel or OTK of the gods. Moving on to their actual effects, we'll start with Slifer. Slifer actually has a pretty unique effect where it alone can act as a floodgate, preventing the opponent from summoning monsters and building a board. For example, Slifer could shut down Dino Rabbit, as Rescue Rabbit would be blown up as soon as it hits the field, and cards like Sabersaurus couldn't even be special summoned without Slifer's effect occurring. Similarly, windups would also be affected, as the majority of their monsters would be susceptible to Slifer's effect. Then why wasn't Slifer ever played in 2012? If Slifer could single-handedly shut down so many decks, why is he so bad? The other Egyptian gods run into the same problem, but going -2 in card advantage and also being incredibly inconsistent means that dedicating your entire game plan to this floodgate is never going to happen before your opponent has set up. What use is a floodgate that can only be summoned after your opponent has set up their evil Sordolka? With the setup needed to get Slifer out, your opponent would have easily set up their board in the meantime, with pieces of interaction that cannot actually affect your board, and so by the time Slifer is summoned, floodgate effect is less useful. And even if you do manage to summon him, what's next? Its attack is contingent on the cards in your hand, which all have been used up in actually trying to get it out, so it means that in most cases Slifer will be walking around with 1k or 2k attack. It also places a constraint on the player. Do you use your cards so you can actually play the game, or risk your Slifer being easily destroyed through battle? And in a miracle scenario where you can somehow summon Slifer turn 1, there's the issue of how the floodgate works. Slifer has little to no protection, so even if the opponent is struggling with summoning monsters to use against Slifer, it doesn't mean that spells or traps are unusable. Fiendish Chain, Mirror Force, Soul Morning, Mind Control, Dark Call, Raigeki Break, Skill Drain, Dimension Prison, Torrential Tribute, Book of Moon are all extremely common ways to deal with Slifer, which require almost no setup to use. How effective can a floodgate be if the setup required means going -2, is inconsistent, and has no protection? Slifer's hypothetical usage in decks can be very aptly summarized from this one Reddit comment. Lots of decks are theoretically hard countered by Slifer the Sky Dragon. This is balanced out by the fact that dedicated Slifer decks are very, very bad. Delete Pengi. Up next is Obelisk. Obelisk's destruction effect is awful, especially when you take into consideration the tributes required to summon it. It's already -2 to see Obelisk touch the field, but when you add on that you need to go another -2 to activate his Raigeki effect, results in Obelisk's utility being unusable. The board wipe effect is definitely a powerful one, especially as Dark Hole and Raigeki were on forbidden and banned limited lists. But just like Slifer's stacking effect, Obelisk's main effect will be hard to proc, as you'll have used up most of your resources to summon it. Now, one way that Obelisk differs from the other gods is that he can't be targeted by effects, which actually makes it stand out, as Obelisk has real protection, which means that previously mentioned cards, like Emergency Evacuation or Book of Moon, would be useless against Obelisk. This makes Obelisk more of a real threat to deal with if he ever hits the board, as if we take a look at the top championship deck in 2011, there's only 3 real threats to Obelisk in the main deck, and 4 synchros in an extra deck that could deal with it. Now, this is still a considerable amount of outs to a free tribute monster, but it helps that not any average card is able to quickly deal with your Obelisk. But on the flip side, if we take a look from the World Championship deck from 2010, Flip Flop Frog was an incredibly easy out that could flip Obelisk back to your hand, and also was easily searchable. So Obelisk was still too heavily matchup dependent to actually call Obelisk a good card. And for the final god card, which the anime would proclaim as the most powerful god monster in the hierarchy, but in real life, the design of the Winged Dragon of Ra's 2 main effects are completely antithetical to each other. Using the first effect of Winged Dragon of Ra to give Ra a stat boost means that you're left vulnerable to single sparks, but most puzzlingly means that you also can't activate Ra's secondary effect to destroy a monster. Conversely, if you opt to not give Ra any attack by sacrificing your life points, you can use the destruction effect, but your Winged Dragon of Ra has 0 attack and 0 defense. With the way Ra's attack and defense gain works, it's all or nothing. You either leave yourself extremely vulnerable, or Ra has 0 attack and defense, with no middle ground. What this essentially means is that Ra is either the most juiced up normal monster, or a more costly version of Raigeki. Investing 3 monsters into a normal summonable monster with 7.9k attack is not worth it, no matter the coolness factor. Funnily enough, Ra's secondary effect of destroying monsters is just Obelisk's, but better. It's much less costly to use, and doesn't require to go -2 every time you want to use it, but it comes at the cost of it being ran over by any monster that's literally 1 or more attack points. It should be fairly obvious to most Yu-Gi-Oh players, casual or competitive, that all the gods are awful with their high summoning cost and lack of utility, but did they ever have real life meta use during their time period? The answer is surprising. Now, Winged Dragon of Ra is straight up awful. As I explained before, there is literally no niche use case where the Winged Dragon of Ra could have been used in the meta. It was by all metrics completely unusable. Slifer was also never used in the meta in any form, because whilst its floodgate effect was extremely powerful, the lack of protection and a high investment hurt it from seeing any sort of competitive viability. However, Obelisk actually managed to see some niche usage in 2 notable decks during the 2010s. Remember how I mentioned that gods wouldn't work without having a deck that would be dedicated to spamming out monsters? Well, actually, there are 2 prominent decks in 2010 and 2013 that would pair naturally with the gods: the Frog Monarchs and Dragon Rulers. Frog Monarchs were a meta deck which combined 2 different archetypes, where it utilized the power of the Monarchs and relied on the consistency of the Frog engine to tribute summon the Monarchs. So what are Monarchs? Monarchs are a group of level 5 or 6 monsters, which all have 2400 attack and 1000 defense, where they each have their own effect, and that's activated when they're tribute summoned. The power of the Monarchs came from their ability to create card advantage, as all of their effects would remove cards from your opponent's field or hand when tribute summoned. The premise of this would be to repeatedly summon the Monarchs, where you would gain a 2400 beat stick and whittle down your opponent's card advantage until you could simplify the board state. To get an idea of the power of the Monarchs, we'll go over two of their most powerful members, with Kai's the Shadow Monarch, which on tribute summon can target one card on the field, banish it, and deal 1000 burn damage. This card being so prevalent in the meta also should show why the Egyptian gods were so awful. Now, one of the meta deck's whole strategy could easily deal with handling the Egyptian gods. This card was phenomenal, as it would banish instead of destroy, which was amazing as it could get past Stardust Dragon and Stardust Road and stop 90% of floating effects. It could deal with most threats and would be an out to most cards in the meta. Even a 1000 life point burn was a nice cherry on top, as life points were a much more vital resource to manage in the slower format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Another card would be Ryza, the Storm Monarch, which spins any card on the field back to the top of the opponent's deck, which would essentially lock the opponent out of a turn, as redrawing a useless card would prevent an opponent from making much progress on their board. It's also incredibly strong when you can summon it 2 or 3 times in a row, where you can stunlock your opponent from drawing the same card for multiple draws. So you've seen where the power comes from Frog Monarchs, but let's talk about the more amphibious side of the deck. The Frog engine is what facilitated the tribute summons of the Monarchs, with the main important engine coming from Treeborn Frog and Swap Frog. Treeborn Frog would allow you to special summon Treeborn Frog from the grave if there are no spell or traps on the field that you controlled. Swap Frog was the other important part of the engine, where on summon you would send one level 2 or lower water aqua monster from your deck or field to the grave. The way this engine would work is by using Swap Frog to send Treeborn Frog to the grave, set up for the next standby phase special summon, and also by recycling cards like Gores or the Monarchs to use their effects for their next tribute summon. Now, rather obviously, Treeborn Frog is what synergized so well with the Monarchs, as it would provide free card advantage on standby phase of every turn, which would provide for great tribute fodder to be used, and Swap Frog could let you spin back a Kais to set up for another banish the next turn. The engine was also incredibly consistent, as cards like Dupe Frog or Substitute would allow you to find Swap Frogs or Treeborn Frogs incredibly easy. Combined, these two archetypes created a remarkably powerful and cohesive strategy, where the Frogs would consistently provide the necessary tributes required for the Monarchs, and in turn, the Monarchs would beat down an opponent through their effects. Now, how exactly did this fit with the gods? If we take a peek at this list from Oscar Roano, that he managed to reach first place with at an Edison event in 2024, you'll notice one particularly muscular blue god on there. As I alluded to earlier, the gods wouldn't fit in any deck, unless there would be plenty of tribute fodder available, which guess what? Turns out the gods would be a perfect match for Obelisk. The downsides of the Egyptian gods needing 3 total tributes is slightly offset with the consistency of the frog package, and similarly, the effect of Obelisk wouldn't be too hard to achieve for the same reasons as before. It's also not like the frog package was the only way to facilitate tribute summoning for Obelisk. Soul Exchange would let you tribute the opponent's monster for Obelisk, and Scapegoat could create tokens for Obelisk's Raigeki effect. The frog package worked incredibly well with Obelisk, as there would be many cases where you'd end up with too many monsters on your field, so Obelisk would even provide a way for the player to get rid of extra frogs. Because of these reasons, Obelisk was a surprisingly good tech option for the early 2010 format, as certain decks would struggle to deal with Obelisk due to its high attack and untargetable nature, which gave the Monarchs a natural way to do vast amounts of damage that fit nicely with the existing playstyle. This video took a long time to make, so if you're enjoying the content then consider subscribing and liking. I'm currently trying to get to 10k subscribers, so even one sub goes a long way in letting me know that this is the kind of content that you want to watch. Obelisk wouldn't see much play outside of Frog Monarchs until 2013, when the Dragon Rulers were introduced. In 2013, the Dragon Rulers completely reshaped the TCG meta. Even to this day, it's still up there in contention as one of the most powerful decks in comparison to the existing meta. The archetype consisted of 8 total cards, 4 adult level 7 dragons, which could also special summon themselves by banishing a mix of 2 dragons or 2 monsters of their same element. And each respective adult dragon had its own baby dragon, which could discard itself and another card to special summon their adult dragon. They synergized incredibly well among themselves, as when a Dragon Ruler is banished, you'd be able to search another dragon of the same attribute from the deck to your hand. Through this loop, it made the Dragon Rulers an incredibly formidable and consistent archetype, as you could always have access to your entire archetype with any 2 Dragon Rulers, and could naturally spam the field with level 7 monsters without using a single normal summon. this alone wasn't the sole reason why Dragon Rulers were so powerful and impressive, as the adult Dragon Rulers were all level 7, which happened to synergize with Dracosac and Big Eye. These two monsters were a key part of what made the Dragon Rulers so formidable. Big Eye could steal any monster that was proving to be too big of a threat, and Dracosac would be practically untouchable, as it couldn't be destroyed by battle or card effects with a single token on board. It could also consistently destroy any card in the field by tributing one token, which meant that single Dracosac could pop a total of 4 cards. With that all in mind, it's no surprise that this deck, true to its name, ruled over the format. So in 2013, Dragon Rulers were the deck to beat. The only other deck, even in the conversation, was a deck that contained a card that let you go +7, but most other decks were just not on the level of Dragon Rulers. If your deck didn't have a way to counter Dragon Rulers, you just simply weren't in contention in the meta. Even if you played the Dragon Rulers, they were still the deck to beat, so various cards were experimented to deal with the threat of them. Spellbooks could run Jaugen the Spiritualist, as it paired nicely with Spellbook of Judgment, letting you special summon any spellcaster from your deck, and add a level equal to or less than the number of cards added to your hand. Evil Swarm were also an effective anti-meta deck, as Evil Swarm Ophion was an Xyz card that prevented level 5 or higher monsters from being special summoned, which happened to fit exactly with the level of the Dragon Rulers. But for the Dragon Ruler mirror match, Obelisk was another tech card that fit nicely within the mirror match. Obelisk for once was a formidable card in the mirror match because of its untargetable nature and high attack points, both of which Dragon Rulers struggled heavily with. Obelisk fit pretty nicely with the Dragon Rulers, as they could spam out adult dragons like it was nothing. Coincidentally enough, Dracosac also synergized incredibly well with Obelisk, as it would provide 2 tokens, which you could use for a tribute summon, or alternatively use those 2 tokens to activate Obelisk's effect. The most common way Dragon Rulers would deal with threats would be Dracosac's destruction effect or Big Eye's stealing effect, but they are unusable on Obelisk because they both specifically targeted the monster. If the deck wanted to remove Obelisk through battle, this would also be a difficult task, as Obelisk's 4000 attack would be over the Dragon Rulers, and there would be very little in the extra deck that could run over Obelisk, with the exception of Ancient Sacred Wyvern, which would still be pretty conditional to use. The only real outs to Obelisk in the mirror match were number 7 Lucky Straight, Black Rose Dragon, and Dark Hall. Lucky Straight's effect worked by giving you 3 chances to roll 2 dice, where if a single 5 was rolled, then Lucky Straight could run over Obelisk. Or if a single combination of 7 was rolled, then Lucky Straight could send all other cards on the field to the graveyard, which wouldn't target Obelisk. Dark Hall and Black Rose Dragon were also outs that existed in the Dragon Ruler deck, but Dark Hall was the one of at the time, and Black Rose still needed a bit of setup to summon, and also required blowing up your opponent's side of the field. Regardless of these outs, Obelisk was a surprisingly viable tech option, especially if the opponent was unprepared for it, and in many cases could single-handedly win the game for the player. Unfortunately, this is pretty much it for the meta relevancy of the 3 original gods, as past these niche uses in the meta, Slifer miraculously had an OCG tournament win, using a level 1 deck with Mystic Piper that would generate monsters to use to summon Slifer. Now, I couldn't find a specific deck list for this win, but here's a sample deck list of what this would look like back then. The general idea would be to use Mystic Piper to draw a card, where if it was a level 1 monster, you could draw another card. This would synergize nicely with Slifer's attack gain effect, and cards like Deep Boys would easily provide the tributes for Slifer. But sadly, the trio of gods never really had any sort of meta relevancy. In the physical card game ever again, the gods within their release year was already outdated, and with each passing year, their relevance diminished. New and exciting boss monsters would come out, with easier summoning conditions, more powerful effects, and even better protection. Cards like Apple Clifford Towers would have similar summoning conditions to the gods, yet be completely invulnerable to spells and traps, and force the opponent to send a monster from their hand or field. Would completely outclass the gods in every way, and this was only in 2014. The existence of new summoning mechanics also didn't exactly help the power creep out any better for the gods, as with any new generation of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Synchro, Xyz, and Lynx, it would introduce new boss monsters that not only would have more powerful abilities than the gods, they most importantly didn't require you to hold a brick in your hand. For example, look at Crystal Wing. Ignoring how much more powerful an effect it has, all it requires is a tuner and a monster where their levels add up to 8. That's the competition the gods had, and it meant that any attempt at support was an uphill battle just to make them usable. So Konami realized this, which is why over the years the gods have been given a variety of support to attempt to simulate the power of the gods from the anime, which can all be accurately summarized as mediocre. For the sake of brevity, we'll just be looking over the general outline of the support and notable pieces. Its first piece of support, and by far the most degenerate, was Ra's Disciple, which, ironically enough, has been more relevant in the meta than any of the 3 original god cards. Its effect let you special summon up to 2 Ra's Disciples from your hand or deck. This card even saw play in the modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta, but unfortunately, it wasn't due to the first effect. The problematic part of the card came from its restriction. Ra's Disciple could not be tributed unless it was for an Egyptian god, and any player who controlled Ra's Disciple could not special summon a monster. This restriction was originally added to prevent free advantage generation that could have been abused for one card combos, whether through Ixie summons, synchro setups, or easy tribute fodder. But in practice, the effect was abused by giving Ra's Disciple to your opponent, since the restriction also applied to whoever controlled the card. Locking your opponent under it meant that they couldn't tribute it, couldn't use it as link material, and most importantly, couldn't special summon it at all. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, where most decks rely on special summoning just to function, this essentially shut them down completely. The only real outs were spell traps, like Dark Hole that could destroy it, but not every deck played those, which often left opponents helpless, entirely at the mercy of the player who set it up. Now, whilst this lock was incredibly degenerate, it wasn't something many decks could consistently abuse at first. Ra's Disciple wasn't searchable, and setting up a way to give it to your opponent wasn't always easy. That is, until Branded. All you need to know is that Branded Fusion, Branded Expulsion, and Albion the Sanctified Dragon enabled this strategy perfectly. Branded Fusion, the deck's primary playmaker, could send Ra's Disciple from your deck to the graveyard, essentially acting as a foolish burial. Then either Albion the Sanctified Dragon or Branded Expulsion could be used to special summon Ra's Disciple to your opponent's field, locking them out of special summons. Earlier, I mentioned that the Winged Dragon of Ra was the worst Egyptian god, having seen the least amount of play. That wasn't entirely accurate. In fact, the Winged Dragon of Ra is arguably the most played card from the Egyptian god archetype, just not its original form. In 2015 and 2016, Konami released two alternate forms of her favorite golden chicken, the Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode, and a Winged Dragon of Ra, Mortal Phoenix. In the anime, Ra had a card effect so long, half of the card text in Ra alone would have made Yu-Gi boomers post a 10-page dissertation on why Yu-Gi-Oh's dying. So these two cards were printed to simulate those variations. Immortal Phoenix aimed to represent Marik's repeated use of Ra by having it resurrect from the graveyard after being destroyed. It was unaffected by card effects and could send any monster on the field to the grave. However, it never saw real competitive play outside of dedicated Ra decks, mainly because it added yet another level 10 brick to already bricky hands. On top of that, its own effect forced it to send itself to the grave at the end of the turn, hurting its long-term viability. Sphere Mode, on the other hand, was a completely different story. It made Egyptian gods more relevant to the meta than ever before. This card was such a staple that you'd even see it in tournament-winning decks. It was a massive success, appearing in casual, rogue, and meta decks alike. For a brief moment, the gods, well, at least one of their forms, finally had their place in competitive play. But it wasn't used to summon Ra. You see, Sphere Mode's effect worked by attributing free monsters from either side of the field, and then normal summoning it to that side of the field. You could tribute Sphere Mode, and then special summon Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, and at the end of the turn, Sphere Mode would return to its owner's field. Sphere Mode's most powerful use wasn't its special summoning effect to bring out Ra, it was instead relegated to be a free tribute lava golem or kaiju. Now, it would allow you to easily remove problematic monsters that can negate your plays, and also remove any monsters with any sort of protection. But most importantly, the opponent couldn't stop it, unless they happened to be running something like Mask of Restrict. That alone made Sphere Mode a staple from the moment it was released, continuing to see play even in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! That's not to say it was the perfect board breaker though, as it would require your normal summon, which could severely limit certain decks, and was incredibly format dependent. For some decks, they wouldn't even end up on free monsters, which meant that you wouldn't be able to summon Sphere Mode, as it strictly required free monsters. Even if the opponent ended on 3 or more monsters, typically there wouldn't be free cards worth sending to the grave to use Sphere Mode on, where kaiju could simply suffice. It would also be harder to deal with, as you couldn't target it with effects or attacks, which also was not a problem with kaijus. And with the advent of link monsters, Sphere Mode would be a free link material for any monsters, like SP Little Knight. Sadly, Sphere Mode has been the most meta relevant the cards have ever been. Ironically enough, the power of the gods translated from the anime to the TCG was all over the place. Ra was by far the best god in the anime, but with its first card in 2012, it was the worst out of the trio. But then a version of Ra became the most played god, leaving the other two gods in dust in terms of meta relevancy. Apart from the Ra forms, the only pieces of support that came from before 2020 was 2 spells. True Name, which was a gimmick card that was a reference to the anime, with no attempt of making it good, and Mind of the Bound Crater attempted to give the gods their protection from the anime. But unfortunately, tying protection to a field spell that could be destroyed with MST was just not enough to move the needle. Konami, on some level, recognized this disparity of the gods from the anime to the card game, and attempted to bring the gods closer to their power in the anime. If you take a peek at the anime god effects, you'll notice that a lot of the effects are taken out, and by a lot, I mean a lot. What Konami basically did was split the power of the gods into different spells and traps. You've already seen this with the Mortal Phoenix, but Millennium Relevation would entirely bypass Winged Dragon of Ra's special summoning restriction to bring it more in line with the anime, where Ra was continuously special summoned over and over. It's blatantly obvious, especially with the arbitrary send Ra to the grave at the end of turn effect, which doesn't really make sense from a balance perspective, since Ra doesn't need to be balanced, when all the gods were already forced to be sent to the grave after being special summoned, and somehow 20 total extra pieces of support barely made the Egyptian gods viable in any way. Ra received by far the most amount of support, which compared to the other gods would mean that you could at least somewhat build a deck around. Not that you should, but you definitely can if pain is your thing. Ra got various waves of support past its initial forms, with its effects in the anime being split up into various spells. No, not even close. In terms of the hierarchy of competency in the Yu-Gi-Oh meta, you could place it at the fun tier, which is the nice version of saying only play if you don't mind losing. Slifer and Obelisk fared even worse, where they received support in the forms of two structure decks, rather creatively named Egyptian God deck Slifer the Sky Dragon and Egyptian God deck Obelisk the Tormentor. These structure decks weren't even worth the cardboard they were printed on. It's an exaggeration to even call them decks, as Obelisk has a total of 4 spell and trap supports, and Slifer has a whopping 2 whole extra support cards, which means that it could quite literally be impossible to run a pure Slifer Obelisk deck without combining it with another archetype. None of these cards ever made the gods in your rogue status, and were pretty obviously designed to stay a casual deck. But that's not to say there wasn't some sort of experimentation, due to a combination of masochism and glimmers of hope within the design of the cards. To get a better understanding, I'll give a quick rundown of each support. Beginning with Ra, Marek Slime cards were retrained into support for the Winged Dragon of Ra, which included Reactor Slime, Guardian Slime, and Egyptian God Slime. Reactor Slime would let you summon tokens which could be used for tributes for any god, or even Obelisk's Raigeki effect, and in the battle phase, let you set Metal Reflect Slime. This card is awful. It requires a normal summon, so if you don't have one of the support cards that let you normal summon again, you can't even summon a god using the tributes you set up. Now there is a variation of a Ra deck that you can make where you use Double Wild, a card from a completely different archetype, to make a 2-card combo, where you could use Double Wild on Reactor Slime to add Guardian Slime, and then special summon it using a Double Wild to summon Egyptian God Slime. This variant of the deck is awful, as Double Wild only works on cards of the same type, which means that you need to overhaul the deck to use Aqua types, and is worthless, because now you've just completely rehauled the deck for a mediocre 2-card combo. Guardian Slime lets you search out any card that mentions Winged Dragon of Ra when it is sent to the grave, which honestly is phenomenal, considering the weird decision of barely printing a searcher for the card the deck is based around, and as a nice bonus can also serve as a wall. But if the game has gotten to that point, then you've probably lost. The most important of the slimes though is Egyptian God Slime, which you summon out by tributing Guardian Slime, has battle protection, forces your opponent to only target Egyptian God Slime for attacks and effects, and can serve as either 1 or 3 tributes for a tribute monster. It's a pretty good card. It provides protection for your other cards, can't be ran over, and also allows you to actually summon out the gods. It's a pretty crucial card in the deck that uses any of the 3 gods, as it's one of the 2 ways to normal summon it. Otherwise, without it, you'll have a hard time even getting them out. Ra has a total of 5 spells that support it, where pretty much all of them but one suck, and with how limited the options are for god support, some builds may run a couple of these. Ancient Chant is a clear standout, with it being a spell that lets you search out Ra, and also gives you another normal tribute summon, whilst also providing Ra with its anime effect of actually gaining attack, so you won't need to decide between having 100 life points or having a usable monster. It's also part of a 2-card combo of Guardian Slime, where Guardian Slime searches out Ancient Chant, and then you can summon Egyptian God Slime, use Ancient Chant to search out Ra, and then summon it, which unfortunately is this deck's equivalent of a consistency play, as the other pieces of support are just not on the same level. True God is also fine. It lets you add any Winged Dragon of Ra support, or Ra himself to your hand, which is a useful consistency booster. Its main purpose is to set up Immortal Phoenix, as you can send Immortal Phoenix from your deck to the grave, and then Ra on your field to proc Immortal Phoenix's effect. Blaze Cannon reads like an incredibly broken card, giving Ra its godlike protection in the anime, gaining absurd amounts of attack by tributing monsters, and also sending every monster your opponent controls to the grave after it attacks. You'll need to consider how the deck already functions. It's incredibly inconsistent, so any card that requires Ra in the field will be a brick in the hand until it gets summoned. With a deck where the whole premise means that you need to run multiple copies of a level 10 card, adding another card that needs Ra on the field won't help. It serves as a win more card. Blaze Cannon doesn't help you reach your goal. It's just a card that you use when you're in an advantageous situation, which is not what the deck needed. Millennium Revelation is an awful piece of support that's sole purpose is to basically remedy the fact that Ra can be special summoned, but doesn't really do much other than that. It's also a clear sign of how the support cards are designed with the anime in mind, rather than actually being good, as it weirdly relies you on having Monster Reborn, which is an attempt at anime synergy with how often Monarchs used Monster Reborn to bring out Ra. The traps are even worse, were they barely even worth mentioning. Sun God Unification is a very bizarre card, which, for even casual play, its utility doesn't even make sense, and Dark Spell Regeneration effect is so completely different from the archetype's intended goal, and even if its effect was worthwhile, it's too slow to even think about running. Ra had by far the most effects in that anime, which is why it took so many cards to simulate the different number of effects it had. The problem with this though is that tying 6 different effects to 6 different cards means that the individual cards are incredibly mediocre. Cards that attempt to play catch up to the anime version of the card means that the focus on any Egyptian god support won't be focused on making the deck good, but rather making the cards play like the anime. For example, when you get cards where it attempts to fix a monster card by overwriting its lack of ability to special summon, but still gets sent to the grave at the end of the turn, turns out to be a recipe of disaster. Obelisk has even less support than Ra, with 2 spells and traps. Fist of Fate is another win more card like Blaze Cannon, where you'll need Obelisk on the field, and doesn't do anything if you don't control it. Like before, this is a pretty good form of disruption, but really isn't what the deck needed. The Breaking Rune God is a phenomenal piece of support, as it lets you easily special summon Ra from your hand or grave, and also makes it invulnerable to effects. More cards like this would be enough to make the God's rogue tier, as it does everything you'd want for a high tribute deck like this. Easily brings out your God, and makes it invulnerable like the anime. The crazy part of this effect is actually the second effect, where if 2 monsters are tributed, you can banish all monsters your opponent's grave, which is so over the top, but somehow works well with the design of Obelisk. This card can be used as an extremely powerful form of disruption, along with Soul Energy Max, as that card also tributes 2 monsters, which can then be comboed together, banishes all monsters from your opponent's grave, deals 4k burn damage, and on top of that, can even OTK your opponent on your turn, if they have 8 monsters in their grave. It also can't be negated, which means that this generally can be a real threat to your opponent. Now, does this 2-card combo make Obelisk viable? Not really, but quite literally is the only play that you can make with Obelisk, and it's a pretty good one at that. Soul Energy Max isn't a card that's actually good, it's pretty mediocre, but with the lack of options you have for Obelisk, it becomes a must run in the deck. Its searching effect being tied to a trap is also generally an insane design choice, because in the intended playstyle of the card, Soul Energy Max requires you to have Obelisk on the field, but you can only use the search effect of the card after it hits the grave, which, you know, is a lot less useful when you already have an Obelisk on the field. Obelisk's final piece of support is Magical Trick Mirror, which is just another card like Dark Spell Regeneration. That is barely worth mentioning and does not fit with Obelisk's playstyle at all. Slifer has a measly 2 pieces of support, Thunder Force Attack and a revived Sky God. Thunder Force is another blowout anime card that requires Slifer to be on the field. For some reason, the drawing effect doesn't even occur if you activate it during your opponent's turn, which is 80% of this card's use, so basically sees no play in any variation of the deck. Revived Sky God is definitely a very interesting card, and is why Slifer has seen some of the most experimentation out of the 3 other builds, which we'll get onto later. Revived Sky God lets you special summon Slifer from your grave, and then lets each player draw cards until they have 6 in their hand. The graveyard effect is pretty much useless, but obviously being able to draw 6 cards is pretty broken, especially if you're able to set it up on your first turn, so your opponent is unable to draw many from this card. The last 2 cards I'll quickly go over are generic god card support, which is Soul Crossing, a quick play spell that lets you tribute summon a god monster using any 3 monsters on the field, but if you use a monster your opponent controls after this card is used, you can only use 1 effect per turn, ignoring god monsters. This is a mandatory free of in any deck focused around the gods, as it allows you to special summon the gods, and rather brokenly, acts as disruption, as you can remove up to 3 of your opponent's monsters on the field. It also is unique in the fact that it bypasses boss monsters, that are unaffected by effects, as it changes the rules for the player and doesn't affect the actual monster on the field. This is a pretty important distinction, as it lets you tribute away a Psychic End Punisher or Ultimate Falcon. It does have a pretty heavy downside, but with the god support, it's a take what they can get at this point. The final god support we'll bother mentioning is Ultimate Divine Beast. It's another situational piece of god support with a destruction effect that's too slow to be useful, and also requires you to control god face up on the field to proc, which should not be too hard for the opponent. It also is a reminder of how badly the gods were designed from day one, as this card doesn't doesn't even work with Ra. Despite the poor quality of support, there have been various attempts at experimentation of the god cards with combinations of existing archetypes. Hitching the gods to a deck like Snake Eyes or Labyrinth didn't actually make them any better, but are basically ways to attempt to play semi-competent versions of the god decks, as unfortunately the gods don't really function on their own. Not only do they not work on their own, they don't even work with each other, as all of their supports only work with their specific gods, so adding them all together causes even more bricking. And Slifer quite literally has 2 support cards dedicated to it. But if you're going to play them, understand that they aren't designed to be fully competitive. It's more that they're the best attempt at bringing the gods into a competitive setting, and it's not something that is exactly optimal. But you probably didn't care about that if you wanted to bring a 15-year-old card against Fiendsmith. Given Obelisk's lack of support, one such way duelists could build a deck using Obelisk's new support would be to pair a deck that generates high number of tributes for soul energy bags, or for Obelisk's effect to proc the Breaking Rune God's graveyard effect. Snake Eyes worked well in fitting in the Obelisk support, as Snake Eyes would be able to generate vast amounts of summons incredibly easily, as basically every card in the deck would generate multiple pieces of monster tributes, like Snake Eyes Ash, Poplar, Oak, and Sinful Spoils. The way Obelisk would fit into the final board of the deck would be to use Flamberge Dragon to special summon Obelisk from the spell and trap zone so that Soul Energy Max's condition can be fulfilled. When Flamberge Dragon is sent to the grave, which is normally done by using IP Masquerena to link summon using Flamberge, which special summons an Oak or Ash, which both special summon another monster, coincidentally happen to summon 2 tributes for Soul Energy Max. This basically turns Obelisk into a form of disruption to the Snake Eyes board, as if the Breaking Rune God is in the grave and Soul Energy Max is used on the field, you can destroy all monsters on your opponent's field and banish all cards in your opponent's grave, which is an incredibly deadly, unnegatable piece of interaction. The reason this works so well is that Snake Eyes is an incredibly consistent deck due to the amount of 1-card combos, so adding in the inconsistent Obelisk package isn't as deal breaking, and Oak or Ash can summon on your opponent's turn to generate the material for Soul Energy Max. The most popular build for Slifer involved attempting to abuse Slifer's Draw 6 trap and ignoring the tributes needed for Slifer, and finding a way to send Slifer to the grave. So the revived Sky God could special summon Slifer as a floodgate on your opponent's turn. The most natural conclusion would be to use the trap focus deck, which Labyrinth happened to fit the bill with. Labyrinth works well with revived Sky God, as the Lady Labyrinth of the Silver Castle can search out revived Sky God, protect it from destruction effects, and the lovely Labyrinth of the Sky Castle can search recycled revived God from your grave. This also means that the revived Sky God doesn't need to be ran at free, and can be searched out, which gets over part of the issue of the inconsistency. However, you'll still need to pray that you have Slifer in your hand, and trust that you have a piece of furniture to pitch it. For Ra, funnily enough an archetype that fits snugly with Ra is another Egyptian god theme deck. The Horus archetype revolves around King's Sarcophagus, which can spam out high level monsters like Hapi, Imseti, and I'm not pronouncing that, can also special summon themselves from the grave. These not only provide tributes for Ra, but also have high attacks so Ra can go for the OTK when used with Ancient Chant, or even be used for their own beatdown. This deck functions well as a going second OTK deck, as Fear and Soul Crossing allow for uninteractable removal of opponent's monsters. Not as good as the other common Horus builds with other decks, but probably one of the best ways to build a deck revolved around Ra. So now you've seen most of the Egyptian god support up to modern day, with cards dedicated to each specific god, why didn't any of these cards bring them up to modern play? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Starting with the 3 gods, they are all inherently poorly designed. Ra's destruction effect and attack gain work in contradiction to each other, making it by far the worst god, and you can't even special summon it, which causes this awkward piece of text needed to be added on, to even allow Ra to be special summoned. Obelisk's effect also is pretty bad for the modern age, and whilst it does have some protection, it got outdated pretty fast even 3 years after it got released, and Slifer's effect, whilst novel, can easily be shut down with a single effect negation, which causes him to become a 0 attack monster. And they also all are free tributes with an insane clause to send them to the grave after 1 turn, which means that any support given to them is an incredibly steep uphill battle, where a functioning deck needs to actually be able to normal summon them out, or else they'll be on the field for 1 turn. If you look at the support cards, with the exception of Ra, you can't even call it an archetype, as even with the 2 structure decks, Konami didn't really give easy ways to tribute summon them apart, from a single spell that forces you to only use 1 effect per turn. We can also look at Konami's other attempts to revitalize old anime decks to see what the issues are. If we look at probably the best example, we have Blue Eyes, which has seen meta relevancy in 2 different formats. So how is Konami able to revitalize Blue Eyes but not the gods? Well, for one, the biggest differentiator between Blue Eyes and the gods is the goal of the deck. Both decks have the same struggle of attempting to make a high tribute monster keep up with the modern game, but the key difference lies in how they are used. With Blue Eyes, keeping Blue Eyes on the field is not the integral part of the deck. Blue Eyes is always just used as a combo piece. Its inclusion on the board is never seen as the power play of the deck, whereas if you look at the design of the archetype of the gods, it seems to be primarily designed around getting the god on the field and resolving admittedly powerful spells and traps to support the god. If Konami took the same design choice they did for the gods, Blue Eyes wouldn't even have new Blue Eyes synchros that are anti-meta, or even better new versions of Blue Eyes. They'd simply just add more ways to special summon Blue Eyes onto the field, and adding spells and traps that makes Blue Eyes invulnerable and causes it to banish all monsters in your opponent's grave. Konami has basically placed themselves into a design flaw with their approach of decks based around the anime. Cards like Dark Magician, Gods, Neos, and Yubel won't ever be retrained to the point where they become replaced in the deck. They seem to want to integrate the exact copy of the cards from the anime into real life decks. Now this can work really well with instances like Yubel, where it's still an integral part of the deck, but doesn't feel like it's holding the deck back as much. Even with vanilla cards like Neos or Dark Magician, there can always be upgraded forms of it, like the Dark Magician fusions or Neos fusions. But with the gods, they are the intended final card to be on the board, and as Konami won't ever retrain the gods, they're stuck making new pieces of support that attempt to patch up the gods to their anime equivalents, in one effect and one card at a time. As such, the first current wave of support we have is playing catch up with their better broken anime counterparts, which is a recipe for disaster. And it's not like Konami hasn't been relatively successful with invigorating an old archetype similar to the gods. Ironically enough, the Timu version of the gods, the Sacred Beasts, also received their own structure deck, and has received way more competent support that actually allows you to play a deck focused to the gods, instead of forcing the gods to room with other archetypes. Currently, the design approach of Konami with the gods is adding new spells or traps that only augment the gods, or allow them to be special summoned for one turn, or do things the existing cards already do. They are heavily limited by the very nature of forming a deck around the gods. It's a protect the castle archetype, but you barely have any reliable ways to get out your castle, and a castle is more like a small sand castle. If you look at the Sacred Beasts, they have 4 different cards that can search out the Sacred Beasts, that are competently designed, so you can actually form an archetype around them. And the search also isn't tied to one specific beast, so every time Konami wants to introduce new support for them, there isn't a Sacred Beast left out. So what can Konami even do to fix the gods? Without going into too much detail, the best way would be to introduce a sub-archetype that can actually support all 3 gods by searching them or summoning them. If Konami's dead set on not retraining the gods or erratering them, having a general archetype that would support divine beasts, so they wouldn't need to create 3 new searchers for each god. In fact, this would fit perfectly with some sort of Egyptian servant deck, similar to what Monarchs' family were doing in the anime, where you could implement different monsters that could search the gods, or add an extra tribute normal summon, or even adding protection. Making the gods relevant again can definitely be done. It's really strange for how well known the gods are, that they've still been relegated to basically scraps for support, and it's not like they can't make an anime deck meta or rogue tier, given how they've done it 2 times in 2 different decades with Blue Eyes. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed watching my content, and hey, if you enjoy this one, you might enjoy this other video where I talk about Yugi's deck as a whole and how it shouldn't have worked in anime.